Today we're going to be covering Verdance. And probably the most interesting thing about her deck from building it is trying to figure out how far you want to lean into your life gain and arcane versus your physical attacks. It definitely feels very similar to Icelander in that regard, where you are trying to chip down your opponent via efficient attacks and just overall playing very efficiently while also having, a solid arcane endgame and also being able to mix in disruption. The biggest difference, of course, is the fact that she doesn't play during your opponent's turn. So while Icelander mainly played her disruption during her opponent's turns, that'd be something like instant speed CLF, or even just like frostbites every single turn cycle. Her disruption mainly comes with things like Felling of the Crown and Plow Under. These cards are really powerful, and they are basically disruption pieces that you don't have the option to interact with. So you don't really have the option to, play around Felling of the Crown, right? Because that's just always going to rip a card from your hand to the bottom of your deck. And as long as there's a card in your arsenal, you're not really going to be able to interact with Plow Under unless it's like an instant like Sigil. So while she obviously isn't an ice hero, she does have some pretty powerful disruption with the Earth package. Our game plan is to play efficient attacks in the early game, mainly decompose cards so that we're able to fill our graveyard and our banish to get to 8 Earth, so that way we can unlock the second half of our ability, which is going to turn our life gain into arcane damage. So because of that, we need a pretty tight ratio of Earth cards. It is the most unfortunate part about this deck is that you are forced to run so many kind of bad 2-block Earth cards, right? This is obviously a design intention behind LSS to not just let you stack this deck with, like 3 blocks and all these really good cards and also have access to this hero power. So we have to work for this payoff. So if you want to look at the stats here, we're on 40 Earth cards. The idea is that we want 2/3 of our deck to be Earth, so that way we're just able to consistently try to get this online when we can, because while our life gain cards are kind of okay and normally close to rate, if we can throw the arcane into it, then this deck speeds up its endgame process a lot faster. So because of that, we're playing things like Cadaverous Tilling. This is just a Wounded Bull that decomposes 3. So if you have, like 2 Earth cards and an Earth action card as well, you can basically get up to 3 Earth cards in your banish. So if you just play something like this like 3 times, then you have the hero ability online. So to help fill our graveyard with Earth cards, we're obviously playing a lot of things that we want to block with, and then we're also playing things like Fruits of the Forest. This is a yellow sigil essentially for the deck, but the biggest thing is that this lets you put Earth cards into your graveyard very quickly. So if you go first and you draw these, you can just dump them immediately into graveyard. Even if you're going second and you have one in hand, you could just discard it during your opponent's turn and get even further ahead in that game plan. And then we're decomposing all of these, right, with things like Felling and Rootbound Carapace. So the hope here is that you would be able to fill your graveyard fairly quickly, so that way you can get your decompose and then move into the second stage of your game plan, which is going to be sending arcane damage via healing. So obviously you have fruits, right? Pretty strong because you could play something like your attacks, right? So you could play like E-Strike for 7, hold a card in hand, and it's a fruits. Your opponent blocks, and then you fruits and discard and then ping them for 1, and they probably take the 1. And that doesn't sound super exciting. However, when life totals are single digits, that kind of stuff can make or break the end game. Also, it turns things like Pulsing Aether / Life, this meld card, while it's pretty good in the early game, it becomes even more impactful in the late game. And so with all of these, we're also playing Waning Moon. This just lets us, chip in for 2. I think your weapon is probably the least exciting part of this deck, to be honest. I don't really know if the new weapon for her is worth playing currently. And then also, like Waning Moon at your end game, when you use Striders, right, can also chip in for that final 3. In terms of the equipment, sadly, we don't really play any of the new cards. They are in the sideboard with Barkskin. Barkskin is pretty good. I think it comes in for your aggro matchups. However, I think for your normal game plan, you're going to want to play Tunic. This lets you play something like Harvest Season without needing to pitch an extra card, which is really good, right, if your turn is going to be like Harvest Season into one of these like 3 costs. If you're doing something like that, you obviously want Tunic. So, there's really not any reason to play something else, right? And then Crown is here until we see what happens to Zen with the nerf, and then also what happens to Brute in the current meta. We're just playing Crown in decks. If things change, we'll go back to balance, but with Art of War being banned, there's a pretty high likelihood you would just rather have Crown. We do have Striders mainly because we have to have our opponent respect an endgame reach, and that is how we're going to close the game out. And then we're on Goliath Gauntlet, which seems really interesting. My current philosophy with the card is that we play so many attacks and it's just always online, right? It's always going to be worth 2. When you look at all the other options, you're looking at something like Metacarpus, which in this deck is usually only going to be worth 1. We do play Metacarpus, of course. That's for, like the mirror and against Rune Blades, but it does feel fairly weak. Ironhide Gauntlet, but we don't pitch during our opponent's turn. So it's not the same as Icelander, where she just always had, the option to sometimes play something out of Arsenal and then also use the Ironhide Gauntlet. You have to exclusively use it with Tunic, which isn't bad, but I do think when you're playing stuff like CNC and when your main game plan in the first half, right, well, this carries out for the entire game, but your arcane damage doesn't matter as much in the early game. You're mainly trying to chip your opponent down via these attack action cards. Having the 2 damage here feels pretty relevant, especially when we look in the sideboard with things like Humble and the Weakest Link. Being able to buff those up to 8 is pretty strong, and that's also why we're playing Flourish, is because all the decomposed earth cards that attack gain stat bonuses, which also are going to basically double in a lot of cases with Flourish. And in the case of Goliath, it would double, right? So instead of your CNC coming in for 8, it comes in for 10, right? That's pretty relevant into decks that have fridges or, depending on how many cards they can afford to block with. So we're trying Goliath Gauntlet, right? This could of course change, but it feels pretty reliable right now considering the amount of attack action cards. Like the only thing it doesn't work with is E-Strike, right? So we play efficient early game, we're blocking a lot, we're playing 2-card hands, we're filling up the grave, we're banishing, we're getting our sweet 2-card hands with felling, so powerful. And so what do we do after that, right? Well, like I said, in the end game, things like Heartbeat are naturally going to come back in your second cycle because you're going to pitch them early game. This becomes really strong. You're going to gain 3 and deal 3 to your opponent. You can play this off Tunic, you can play this with a blue and then Waning Moon after. Our real powerful finishers are going to be cards like Rampant Growth. Now we're only on 2 because it doesn't block and it doesn't do anything early game. This is really only powerful in your second cycle. And while you can, clearly pitch it to get the second cycle, you'd rather have a blue. So we're only trying 2 for right now. I think the instant, like no block is a pretty heavy downside for this deck that already has to run so many 2 blocks, right? For a wizard deck that is trying to play mid-range style, like, Icelander, like just value mid-range, the fact that it runs so many 2 blocks is already such a massive problem. Late game, let's say you had a harvest season, right? This is really typical. This is how you'll close out a lot of end games. You'll go like harvest season, end of your, to end your turn. Next turn, you play it with a Rampant Growth, right? So let's say you heal 3, you sigil. In response to the Verdance trigger, you're going to play the Rampant Growth plus life, right? So you gain the 3 off sigil right after your harvest season. So you've gained like 6 for that turn. In response to the Verdance trigger, you're going to play Rampant Growth and life. You'll resolve the 1, deal 1, right? And then your Rampant Growth will buff it, I think in this case by 7. So you'll amp 7 on the Verdance trigger from your sigil. So what that means, it sounds complicated. Basically what this means is that you gain a bunch of life in the end game and then you just like completely blow out your opponent with like a really tall Verdance trigger that they just can't like AB out of. And even if they can like AB it and not die, they go so low that pretty much like any end game past that they just lose to, if not just dying to Striders on the next cycle, right? So for our Striders kill, we're on our blue Emeritus plan. There's really not much else we can do here. We could run red Emeritus, but the card is so bad and it's never playable in any other circumstances. So I think we just play the blue to just naturally pitch. Without Metacarpus, that does let us reach for 7, which, is pretty reasonable for the late game. What's also interesting for this deck right now is that our blues are currently just sideboard tech, right? We're just moving a lot of the blue 3 blocks into main board right now until we get a better idea of what the meta is. So we have Warmongers and we have Scour, right? Pretty self-explanatory. Scours can be really good into something like KO, post-cast bones, and also into the current Rune Blades. And then Warmongers is good into obviously like Rune Blades, Azalea, but in other decks, right, this just becomes a block 3, which is perfectly fine. And then if we go into our sideboard, we have a few things. So we have some 2-cost disruption, mainly Humble and Weakest Link, right? So it's kind of what we talked about earlier, right? We can buff it with Goliath. We have Flourish, right? And we want to convert our hand. We can get an extra +2 on them, so they come in for 10. We also have a Raise Face on our Maybe board along with Stonewall Gauntlet. Stonewall Gauntlet is just on pause for the deck right now until we figure out, what the current landscape looks like, if Zen is, still a meta contender or not. But right now, Humble and Weakest Link are my choices for the 2-cost disruptions. But if more talented heroes, right? So like if the Rosetta heroes pop off, you're going to want Erase Face, right? Or if Mechanologist with a Dio deck becomes insane, you need Erase Face in your deck because it just time walks her. We have these just for right now, but it's not, it's not gospel. And then we have Summer's Fall. This is to deal with Illusionist, because Illusionist is, going to be naturally a problem for our deck. This just lets us bottom their auras, and it can also work into something, like a Florian, right? If they're playing any of the auras that generate rune chance, so something like Runeblood Incantation can be pretty good into them as well. And then we have Evergreen. This is currently here as an answer for Fatigue. There is a problem with this deck where if your opponent was on a Fatigue plan, you are playing Wizards, you do deterministically run out of damage, you don't have a weapon. Evergreen just doesn't let that happen. So if your opponent's game plan was to never take damage and to block you out the entire game, you can just loop Evergreens in the end game. So you just have an Evergreen in Arsenal, you have one in hand, you play the one from Arsenal, you Arsenal the one in your hand, and with 3 cards, you just send 7 every single turn until your opponent can't do anything anymore. And so yeah, that's the deck. Feel free to let me know what you think about it if you want to give it a shot. If you've been trying other stuff and it's been successful, let me know. The biggest question for me is whether or not you want to be playing more tall arcane spells. The main problem is that there really aren't any for Earth. I don't know if it's just how they designed the class, right, for limited, but all of the cards that work with her hero ability and that actually get Earth cards into your banish are all attack action cards. So they're things like Cadaverous, Felling, right? You get the idea. Plow Under. So the main problem is that I don't really know how to build like a tall arcane version of her that's still able to actually turn on her hero ability. The biggest thing is whether or not you want to run Tree. I did opt to cut Tree out. My main problem is that it just doesn't really do anything with your deck. Yeah, it can amp your endgame pings up to 4, but the card feels really weak in every other circumstance, and I think I would just rather be playing Earth attacks and sending them at my opponent. However, I could see a version of this deck that wants to play more amp and wants to play the Millennium Tree. So if that's something you've been trying out, let me know what cards have been working for that game plan, and I'm down to hear you out. But hopefully, this has been helpful for starting you off on Verdance. This list is very mid-rangey, and it will kind of actually be similar to the Florian list that I'm going to put out. They feel almost like 2 sides of the same coin. They play kind of the same game style with mid-range value plus like arcane pings. So, it's weird. The lines are kind of blurred. But until next time, thank you for watching.